Hello fellow Unreal Engine artists, designers and developers, and welcome to another episode of this landscape material series. In today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to manually paint materials onto your landscape using a feature called paint layers, and we'll be showing you how to blend those layers together, including with the original automatic material. Even if you think you know how paint layers work, it's worth sticking around for the end of this episode, because I'll show you how you can incorporate those layers into the procedural content generation. During this series, a lot of people have been asking in the comments about how to manually paint materials onto the landscape using paint layers. So I thought I would add in this tutorial before runtime virtual textures just to show how to do that. It's pretty straightforward to do. So I'll show you how to set it up in the master material, the extra steps you require in the landscape paint tools, and then as a bonus at the end of the episode I'll show you how you can use these newly created layers in your procedural content generation. So let's start off with the master material, and as I said, it's very straightforward to add in extra layers here at the moment. So everything we've done so far has been procedurally generated. If I go back to the viewport, we've not done anything manually here. So we have got 5 layers, and they're all procedurally generated based on height for the snow, slope for the other textures, and then we've used the mask to generate procedural foliage. What if we want to actually paint our own, say, paths or roads, or just other textures on here just for variety? Well, what we can do is we can add other layers. You can add as many layers as you want on here and then paint them manually. So let's go back to the landscape, and before our final output here, we're going to, in fact, let's detach that using the Alt key. So if we drag out from here to landscape functions, and we look for landscape layer blend for here, and then we need to specify how many layers we want. So in the details for this node, let's add 2 to start off with, and the first one is going to be our auto material. So that's everything we've created so far. I'll talk about the blend types in a moment. We don't need to change anything else. And then for the second one, let's create a layer called path, where we can paint paths manually. So blend types, there are 3 types of blending options for your layers. The weight blend looks at all of the layers and makes sure that they all add up to a value of 1. If you've got more, then again you'll divide the weights between them equally. Alpha blend, this layer will be treated as an absolute value. So if you've painted a value of 0 on this layer, it won't show it up. If you've painted a value of 1 on the layer, it will be fully shown up. And it doesn't really matter about the order. So if you want something you just really want to paint pretty much on or off, use alpha blend. Although with 2 layers, there's very little difference here. So I'll leave it as weight blend. The third one, height blend, if you have height information in your textures, so you have a texture with a height mask or a displacement mask, you can use this and it will add another node on the landscape layer blend where you can plug in the height for each layer. And then if you've got 2 layers that meet, it will use that height information to merge them where they meet. So if you had rocks in one layer, they would show up even going into the other layer because they're higher than the other. So we haven't got height information, so let's just leave it as weight blend. Epic Games have a page on the blend types, so you can look into it a bit more detail. Right, so we've got 2 layers here for path and auto material. So for our auto material layer, we will plug the output from our auto material in here. And so this layer will be what we've got so far. Now we've got this extra layer here, we can plug a material into it. So we could either create a whole new material, or we could use an existing material we've got in our master material. Just for now, just to test it out, let's use the mid-high material. So if you type mid-high material and that was the soil. We don't see very much of it because it's just between the grass and the cliff layer. So let's use that material to manually paint paths, and then I'll come back in a minute and add another one, and we'll set up a specific material. So click on Save here, and then go back to your valley here, and you'll probably see something like this, where it's a completely empty landscape, and you will probably get frightened that you've broken everything, but don't worry. Now we've got layers, we need to populate these layers in the landscape paint tools. So if you go to your modes at the top here and switch to landscape mode and go to paint, you'll have two layers here. Now, if you don't see them, and this is pretty common, when you first set up layers, you often have to reload the level in order to see the layers that you've just added. So don't worry, just make sure everything's saved. Go to your file and reload that level. So I'm going to reload the Glacier Valley level. Still got this transparent view of the landscape here. Now, if we go into the landscape, you see now we have those layers there. So don't get frightened. This is pretty common. You have to reload it just to make it see those new layers. And we have two elements here for the auto material layer and the path layer. Now what we need to do is we need to create an asset to hold these layer paints. So for our auto material, we're going to add one. And if you remember that we set it up as a weight blended layer. So if it's a weight blended layer or a height blended layer, you're going to add this. If it's an alpha blend layer, you're going to add this. So both of ours are weight blended layers. So click on add, and by default, it will put it in this maps, and then your the name of your map shared assets. Generally speaking, I would just always use their suggested folder, and it's called it layer name / underscore layer info, auto material layer info. So let's save that. And you see it's created this, and look, you can see that things are starting to appear now. So let's do a Control-Shift-S to save that. And by default, it has filled this layer with a value of 1. That's why our auto material is working. I've just noticed something as well. It's recalculating PCG all the time here. Let's go back into the select mode briefly, and let's just, in our PCG volume, just click on this cleanup on the PCG. All it will do is it will switch it off so that every time we paint something, it's not doing the PCG generation. Once we finish painting our layers, we'll come back and hit generate here to regenerate our procedural content. Okay, so back into landscape. And now we can add our second layer. So choose the path layer. And again, we're going to add a layer info. Again, it's weight blended layer. And by default, it will put it in the same folder and call it path layer info. And let's click save here. And it's created a new element here. Okay. So we now have our two layers here. By default, it has filled this one. Now, if you didn't see the material appear when you've created this first one, what you can do is you can right click on this and do fill layer. So what that means is it will fill that, like a mask, it will fill that layer with the value 1, and then the auto material will be able to write into it. I'm using 5.4, and it seems to do that by default for the first layer, so you shouldn't have to do anything. But if you're seeing any problems, then you can add it in here. Another thing worth talking about here as well is a lot of people were talking about, in the comments, they wanted to import layers from some other world creation tool like Gaia or a terrain creation tool. Now, if you've set up a layer and you want to incorporate that layer information that's been output by World Machine or Gaia, you can then right click and do import from, export to file. Now I'm not doing this in this example, so I don't know the particular settings for your software, but that's the technique you use to import that into this layer. Okay, let's choose our path layer, and we'll talk about how you can paint paths manually. You see I've selected this on the landscape. There is this brush, and you can see the central circle is where it will paint the texture. The outer circle is where it will fall off or fade off from the one texture to the one that's below it. And then in the settings, we've got different settings for brush size and the like, and tool settings. So what we'll do to start off with, just to test this out, is we'll put the tool strength up to 1, so it will fully affect the landscape layer. I'll put the brush size down to 300, so it's much smaller, and I'll leave the brush fall off at half, so there's a little bit of a gradient. And then what we can do is we can go over to a bit of our landscape and start painting. So hold your left mouse button down and start dragging along. And you can see that it's starting to paint that mid-high material. You might see, depending on, again, on your PC spec, you might see a little bit of a delay where you see a blank tile of landscape while it does the first calculations. But you can see, especially without the PCG recalculating, we can paint on here as much as we want. So I'm using the left mouse button, just painting on there. If I want to remove the path from the layer, I'll just hold the shift key down and go over it again, and shift acts like an eraser. So I can remove it. If I want to make the brush bigger or smaller while I'm doing it, use the square brackets. So if I use the right square bracket, it's making the brush bigger. If I use the left square bracket, it's making it smaller. So if I make it bigger, I can obviously paint larger patches, but also I can also erase patches more quickly as well. So nice and easy to use. Let's now create a path. Let's go over to one of our little valleys over here. So this spot here is a natural spot where there would be a path from the valley up to the ridge here. So let's adjust the brush size. So I'm going to put the brush size down to about the size of the path I want. I'll leave the fall off as it is, and then I'll just start with my left mouse button, just start dragging in the path I want all the way up to the top here. And you can see that because it's using that material layer, it's honoring all of the material functions. So as we get closer, we've got the near tiling. As we get further out, we've got the far tiling. Actually, something I'll address in a future episode is you can notice with this mid-high one that the tiling is a bit on the large side, both for the near tiling and the far tiling. But we can't change it without changing all of the other ones. So in a future episode, we'll introduce per layer tiling to give us more flexibility. But we've created a path here. If you want to do any sort of softening of the path, we can adjust things like the fall off here. We can make the fall off larger. We can turn the tool strength down so it's more a more feathery approach. So let's put 0.3. It won't paint it on quite so strongly. So let's just sort of, and what I'm doing now is I'm just dragging it lightly just to create a more sort of a feathered approach around this bottom part. So you can see it's now blending in a little bit more with the textures around it. And I could do that working my way up as well. So the sort of thing you might want to do, especially if you're very artistic, is that you might want to use these textures just to, again, break up some of these textures that are similar at the ground level. So even though we've got near tiling and far tiling and color variation, you might want to mix this forest path with a bit of the mid-high. So again, with this turned down a bit, I'm just going to lightly sort of graze over these spots. And you can see that I'm adding a little bit of the forest path mixed in with, the mid-high soil mixed in. And you can see this really breaks up the repetition of one texture here. So the manual layers can be used for some very sort of obvious paths and textures, but it can also be used for some more subtle mixing of textures between two of the layers here. So you could also, I mean, this gives you an idea as well, is that you might want to use, just like we did for the color variation, you might want to use our noise masks in our master material to vary between two textures in a layer rather than just have one single texture per layer. So again, you should have the tools in your arsenal to do that if you want to do that procedurally as well. Okay, so let's go back to the path here, and what we can do now is we can adjust. So it's a bit bright, that one. So let's go back to our main selection here, and what I want to do is I want to blend that in a bit more so it's a bit less vivid. So we can open up our, if we go back to our main material, we can open up our material instance for the landscape, and I've just put it on the right hand side here. And then what I'll do is I'll find the mid-high layer here. I'm just going to adjust the tint so it's not quite so vivid. So in the mid-high color tint, I'll turn down the value there, something like that. So now it blends in a little bit more with the landscape. Now what if I want to create a material layer completely from scratch rather than use an existing material? Say I want a road surface going through this valley made of asphalt. How do I do that? Let's go back to our material, master material, and we will create another layer here. So let's just add another layer, and I'm going to call this one road. Leave it as weight blend, and click on save. And then obviously I need an input for this. What I want to do is create a completely new layer. So what I can do is I can go to the section of the master material where I set up my layers, and I can just set up another one. So let's just grab this snow layer, do a Control C to copy everything, come down here and paste it. If you remember, all this does is grabs our parameters, what textures we want, what tints we want, and then it spits out the material. So whether we use it automatically or whether we use it in a layer blend doesn't matter. So now all we need to do is just rename this layer and the parameters. So I'll call it road layer, and I'm going to go through each of these parameters in turn and change the word snow to road. So 4 parameters in, and then coming out, I'm going to rename the output road material. And then the only other thing is I'm going to go back to these parameters and put them in a different group. So I'm going to create a road group and assign the other parameters to that group, just so they're in one place in the material instance. Okay, everything done in this layer now. All I need to do is go back to the layer blend and just simply right click, find our road material, and we're going to plug that into the layer road here. Click on save, come back to the landscape, nothing's changed at the moment, and let's go in fact do a save, Control Shift S. Let's go back into landscape mode now. Go to the paint. Can't see the layer there at the moment. Again, just like before, we just need to reload the level. So reload it. Hopefully now, if we go into landscape, we've got a new layer here of road. We need to add the layer info asset. So create layer info, weight blended. It's called road layer info. That's fine. Save it. Do a save. Come back to your paint layer now. If we go to the road layer, let's put the tool strength back up to 1. If we paint here, you can see we are getting the default grid texture here. So now what we need to do is we need to go and find an asphalt texture somewhere in order to plug in the base color and normals, and then we can play around with things like the color tint. So let's open up our material instance. Actually, before we open up the material instance, we actually need to find a texture. So go into Fab. So open up your content browser, click on Fab, get content from Fab. And what you can do here is search for, I'm going to search for asphalt. And you can see that the first 8 items here are textures, probably from Quixel. So let's just pick the first one. Again, it doesn't really matter which one you pick. And I'm going to use medium quality as per normal, add it to the project. And now I have those textures in there. Do a quick Control-Shift-S to save everything. Close down. And now if I open up the material instance, so back to my material instance, and let's come out of landscape mode so we can see a bit more of the landscape texture here. So over on the material instance, let's just move it over a little bit to the right so I can see a bit more of what I'm seeing on that paint layer, and go down to the road group. So we've got this new group here, road, with our 4 parameters. Let's just click on all of them to enable them. And what we can do now is we can select the base color. So I've selected on that road. Oh, sorry, not it's road, it's asphalt, isn't it? So to type in asphalt, pick the base color, and then for the normal, same thing. Start to type asphalt and pick the normal. And now what we have is asphalt in here. And it's a bit on the light side. It looks more like sort of gravel or concrete. So let's take our road color tint and let's drag down the value here, something like that. So now we have this asphalt texture here. Something to bear in mind, by the way, is that when you're painting like this on the landscape, you're painting on the vertices of the landscape. So if I go into wireframe mode here, you can see it's a bit difficult because there's some other elements on here, but you can see that the landscape comprises these triangles of vertices, and they're quite large gaps between them. And that's where we're painting these, where these textures change. So you often see these little artifacts of a sort of a triangular edge in the landscape. Let's go back to lit mode. You often see these sorts of triangular type shadows here, which you don't see in our procedural landscape because we were using pixel masks to blend those in a much finer way. But it's usually not a big issue because you can usually do a little bit of sort of soft blending between, and you can use props and assets to sort of hide those ugly edges. But just be aware of that. It depends on the resolution of the landscape. So smaller landscapes tend to have larger triangles, and larger landscapes the triangles will be closer together. So you can get away with a bit more. Okay, so we've added 2 material layers here. We've added one where we used an existing material up here for our path, and then here we created a completely new material layer. Now, for the last part of today's episode, I want to show you how you can use this information that you've painted on to drive the procedural content generation. So what I mean is, let's just make this a full-size window again. If we switch back our procedural content generated grass, so go to the PCG volume, click on generate to force that to regenerate again. Wait a short while it calculates everything. And you can see here is our grass on our mid-low layer, but it's also spawning the grass over the path as well, because it doesn't know that we've painted this path on top of the mid-low layer of our auto material. So it would be good if there was some way we could determine where these painted layers are, so we can either spawn something specific on there, or in this particular case I want to remove the grass from the paths. So let me show you how we do that in our PCG graph that we set up in the last episode. Okay, so while we're developing this new functionality in the PCG graph, let's make it easy on our PC. First of all, select your PCG volume and hit the cleanup button so that it gets rid of the PCG items that have been generated on the landscape, just temporarily. And then with the PCG volume selected, let's just move it in the landscape. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move it so that it encompasses a bit of the path, so that we can see that the points we generate on the path work properly. Okay, so something like that. So it doesn't have to encompass the whole path, just enough for us to test this out. And then go into the, in the PCG volume, select your PCG component. You'll see the graph there, browse to it and open it up. And you should see something like this from what we set up last time. So this is actually, let's comment this because it's a good idea with PCG graphs, because as you work on them, they tend to get bigger. It's a good idea to sort of say what you're doing in each section. So these first three nodes here, we were getting the mid-low layer. So that's what our surface sampler and our filter did here. These elements here, put a comment around here, was spawn grass clumps. And then finally we spawned the static meshes for the grass. So what we're going to do this time is we want to find where the path is on the landscape, and then we want to exclude the points on the path from the grass clumps. So what we can do is we can take our surface sampler again. So let's, from the landscape data, in fact, just duplicate this one. So duplicate this surface sampler, drag it out from the landscape data. In fact, for these surface samplers at the moment, let's check, select both of them and uncheck unbounded, because we just want to do this within the volume at the moment. And if you look at this surface sampler here and hit A to inspect it, so here are our various attributes, and if you go to the right hand side, you can see that three new attributes have appeared. So we've got the physical material that we saw in the last episode, but now for each layer there's a value here for the point. So if that point is on a path layer where we've drawn the path, it will have a value of greater than 0. If there's not a path or a road texture at that point, it will have a value of 0. So we can use these attributes to determine whether the points are on that particular path or road texture. So let's now let's put a debug on here. No, let's not do that. Let's do a filter first of all. So drag out from here, do attribute filter. And this time we want to filter on the path. So it's where the path is that we want to exclude the grass. So our attribute is path. Let's just hover over it again and see what type it is. It's a float. So we want to, wherever the path is greater than 0, we want to spawn points. So use a constant threshold. It's a float and 0. So this will filter out anything where the path is greater than 0. And that will be effectively generate points just on the path texture that we've drawn. So let's test that out. So if I do a debug on, well, let's do an attribute list first. And you can see now our points all have path values of greater than 0, which is good. And then if we do D for debug, so the debug won't work until we attach something else going forward from this. So let's just temporarily drag on here and do transform points, even though we may not use that. And let's just temporarily disconnect our static mesh spawner so we don't see any grass, and just do come here, and you can see now that where the points are just in or around the path. Now it goes out to here only because I've done some light painting. If you wanted the threshold to be a bit higher than 0, I could make it sort of 0.1 or 0.2. So in fact, let's do that. Let's go back to the PCG graph. In our filter, instead of doing greater than 0, let's do greater than 0.2. Okay, and that's got rid of the points that were in the sort of light parts of where the path met the grass. Okay, so that's fine, but you can see that those points are pretty sparse at the moment. So if we're trying to exclude grass from where these points are, we're still going to get grass in between the points. So let's pack these points close together where the path is. Come back to your graph. In our surface sampler, what we'll do is we'll change the looseness here to 0. So that will do a grid where they're next to each other. And actually, let's see if we can put the points up to 1 as well and see what that does. Okay, and now you can see that it has packed them in absolutely, completely with no space. So if we had that unbounded, it would continue up the hill and fill in this path as well. All right, so now we know the points are in the path. How do we use this information to exclude the grass that we've generated around it? Well, there is a node called difference, which you can use to exclude one set of points from another set of points. So if we take this here and let's move it along here. So I want to do it just before we do the static mesh spawner. So at this point here, we've spawned our grass clumps with other points around it. We've projected it onto the landscape. We've transformed it into different scales. What we can do now, in fact, we can do it before the transform points as well. It doesn't really matter. Actually, let's do that. Let's do the transform points afterwards. That way we don't have to transform unnecessary points. And what we'll do now is we will drag out from here and do a difference. And the difference takes 2 inputs, the source and the things you want to difference. So from this inside filter, we're going to plug that in there. And quite importantly, we need to specify the function here of the difference to binary. It's kind of annoying because I think this should be the default. You rarely use anything but binary. And if you don't select that, sometimes the results aren't exactly what you expect. So make sure you select binary here and then plug your output into the transform points. You will get this. Actually, we need to disconnect the original one. So make sure you hit the Alt key and disconnect the one that was going directly. Now put it in there. You may wonder what this little extra node is here. It's because the output from the difference node is not just point data, it can be other data as well. So this is just converting it from all data to points data only. And now let's look at in fact, let's change the debug now to here. So remember, Control Alt D moves the debug point. So now we're looking at the transform points after the difference. And that looks pretty good to me. So you can see that we have grass clumps all around this hill and this hill, but they're now missing from that central point there as well. We still have some wheatgrass, but that's because we generated the wheatgrass using landscape grass types. If we wanted to exclude that as well, we'd have to put the wheat in the PCG graph as well. So now if we come back to the graph, we switch off our debug, reattach our static mesh spawner, and you now see we have grass everywhere except where the path is. And now, after doing a save of everything with Control-Shift-S, now you can come back to your graph and you can go to the surface samplers. In fact, hit pause regen here. I think I told you to do this in the last episode. As soon as you're getting to a point where you want to generate it over the whole landscape, use this so that it doesn't automatically regenerate it when you make changes. So go to the first surface sampler, change it to unbounded, go to the surface sampler for the path and change that to unbounded. Now you can hit force regen and you will see a little calculation going on in the bottom right, preparing PCG tasks, and after a few seconds hopefully you can see that our grass has been generated, but it's been excluded all the way up that hill, all the way up that path, which is great, exactly what we want. And this will work for any paths that you paint on in the future, although do remember what I said about it's probably worth turning PCG off temporarily when you paint. Otherwise, every time you paint a bit of path in, it's going to recalculate that PCG graph and your computer will be whirring away and grind to a halt while you're doing it. So for example, if I wanted to put another path over here somewhere, what I would do as a working method is I would select the PCG volume, click the clean up button just to switch it off temporarily, and then I would go into my landscape mode, select the layer I want to work on, say the path layer, paint a bit of path here, and when I've finished painting it, I would then come back out of landscape mode. I'd probably hit save just to be on the safe side, and then go back to the volume and click on generate, which will force the regeneration. And again, after a bit of calculation, I will get my grass there, excluding the painted path layer. So you can see that it is pretty flexible in the way that it works. And you get the benefit here of having the automated layers for the main material, still having control over painting where you want other features such as paths, roads, or just generally other textures that you want on there, but they can still form a part of your procedural content generation. One other thing I just want to make sure you realize, in case you do have problems where this isn't working, it should be set by default, but if you go back to the PCG graph, in your get landscape data node here, by default, it should have this get layer weight checked on. That is the attribute that controls it getting these layer weights, auto material, path and road. So if this is switched off, it won't grab these attributes and you won't be able to do the path calculations. So as I said, that's on by default, so it should do it for you. We had to put the get physical material on in the last episode in order to get the physical material for our auto-generated layers. Okay, so that's it for today. In the next episode, we are going to look at runtime virtual textures, which is a technique for saving performance in the generation of your auto materials, and also gives you the facility of blending your foliage and other meshes with the underlying textures that are present on the landscape. Again, it really helps to blend together the meshes and the underlying textures. So quite a useful technique to learn. In a future episode, I will probably show you as well. I'm going to do a few extra episodes in this series to show some sort of specific techniques. You've seen that today in the paint layers, we painted all the layers on manually, but I want to show you a technique in the future where you can do spline-based paint layers. So that gives you a non-destructive workflow where you can specify how you want paths to go, and if you then want to change the paths in the future, you can just drag the spline points around in order to change that, and that will allow you to both paint layers and even to deform the landscape as well. Something like roads, you can make sure the roads are level. So I'll show that in a future episode, so stay tuned for all of those, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.